Moscow, February 4th, 1940. In a specially constructed soundproofed room in Kommunarka, a Soviet state security execution facility outside Moscow, a man is brought in. He is 34 years old, though he looks older. He is small, barely 5 feet tall, emaciated from months of imprisonment and interrogation, physically diminished to a degree that makes him almost unrecognizable from the photographs taken just 2 years earlier, when he was the most feared man in the Soviet Union after Stalin himself. He has been told he is being taken for a medical examination. This is a standard deception of the facility, a small mercy, or a final cruelty, depending on how you read it, the preservation of the fiction of normalcy, up until the moment when normalcy ends permanently. The room he is brought into is not a medical examination room. He is made to stand facing a wall. Behind him, a senior NKVD officer raises a pistol. The pistol fires. The man falls. His name is Nikolai Ivanovich Yezhov. He was, from 1936 to 1938, the head of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, the institution that was the primary operational instrument of the Great Terror. During his tenure, approximately 750,000 people were executed by the NKVD, and approximately 1.3 million people were sentenced to the labor camps of the Gulag. He signed the orders. He directed the operations. He expanded the scope of the terror with an energy and a thoroughness that earned him a specific place in the history of political violence. The Soviet population called this period the Yezhovshchina, the Yezhov time, the time defined by his name, attached to the terror as if he were its author rather than its instrument. The name was a way of attributing the violence to a specific person rather than to the system that generated it, a displacement that served specific political purposes once the terror needed to be explained and contained. Now he is dead, executed by the institution he ran, killed by the system he served. Shot in a room designed for exactly the kind of killing he had overseen thousands of times. This is his story. It is the story of how a man becomes a mass killer in service of a political system, what that process looks like from the inside, and what happens when the system decides that its instrument has become its liability. It is not a story about a monster in the simple sense that the word monster is sometimes used to exempt us from the harder work of understanding. It is a story about a human being in an institutional environment that produced mass murder, about the specific mechanisms through which ordinary people become perpetrators of extraordinary violence, and about the terminal logic of a system that consumes everyone who serves it deeply enough. Nikolai Yezhov was born on May 1st, 1895, in St. Petersburg, into a working-class family of Lithuanian origin. His father was a factory worker, his mother a domestic servant, his origins about as proletarian as the revolutionary movement required of its authentic representatives. He grew up in poverty, received minimal formal education, and worked as a metal worker in his youth before the First World War, and then the revolution provided alternative trajectories. He served in the Tsarist army during the First World War and joined the Bolsheviks in 1917, making the transition that hundreds of thousands of young working-class men made in that revolutionary year from the military service of the old regime to the political commitment of the new one. His background and his party membership placed him in the category of the authentic proletarian Bolshevik that the party celebrated and promoted, and his abilities in organizational work brought him to the attention of senior figures who recognized what his specific combination of energy, organizational intelligence, and absolute loyalty could contribute to the party apparatus. His physical appearance was notable and was noted by virtually everyone who encountered him. He was exceptionally small, standing approximately 1 meter 51 centimeters, with a slight build that made him appear younger than his age, and that created a visual contradiction with the authority he eventually wielded. He was careful about his appearance, attentive to the signals that dress and manner sent in the hierarchical world of the Soviet party apparatus, and the contrast between his diminutive physical presence and his eventual institutional power was something that contemporaries remarked on consistently. He rose through the party organizational apparatus through the 1920s, working in regional party organizations before being brought to Moscow, where his organizational abilities and his political reliability brought him into the central party apparatus. He worked in the party's organizational department, the institutional machinery that managed appointments and personnel throughout the party hierarchy, giving him both practical experience in the mechanics of organizational power and a developing network of relationships throughout the party apparatus. His rise accelerated in the early 1930s as Stalin's consolidation of power proceeded, and as the importance of the party apparatus as the primary instrument of that consolidation became clearer. Yezhov was a man of the apparatus in a specific and complete sense. His entire professional identity was defined by party organizational work, by the management of personnel, and the exercise of institutional power through administrative mechanisms. He had no independent political ideas, no factional affiliations that competed with his loyalty to the current party line, no intellectual positions that might complicate his utility as an instrument of Stalin's will. These qualities, the absence of independent standing, the completeness of his organizational loyalty, the specific combination of administrative competence and personal devotion to Stalin made him precisely the kind of person that Stalin was looking for, as the terror required an operational leader of specific qualities. The man who would run the Great Terror needed to be capable of the enormous logistical and administrative demands of mass repression while remaining completely subordinate to Stalin's direction. He needed to be someone who would not develop independent political ambitions from the institutional power he would wield, who would use that power entirely in service of Stalin's requirements and not his own. Yezhov appeared to offer all of these qualities. His relationship with Stalin was personal as well as professional, characterized by the kind of devoted personal loyalty that Stalin cultivated in the people closest to him. Stalin called him by the diminutive Yezhov, used familiar forms of address in their interactions, treated him with the warmth that Stalin reserved for the people he had decided to trust completely. Yezhov reciprocated with a devotion that his correspondence and his public statements confirm was genuine, the attachment of a man who understood that his standing, his identity, and his safety all depended on his relationship with the man at the center of the Soviet system. He was appointed to the Central Committee's Party Control Commission in 1934, a position that gave him oversight of party discipline and a direct involvement in the investigation of party members for political reliability, the kind of institutional role that was both preparation for and intimately connected to the work that the NKVD would perform during the terror. He was involved in the investigations that followed the Kirov assassination in December 1934, working alongside the NKVD in the initial wave of arrests and interrogations that the assassination provided the pretext for. His involvement in these investigations gave him both practical experience in the mechanics of political prosecution and a deepening relationship with the institutional apparatus of state security. He learned the system from the inside, understood its methods and its culture, developed the relationships with NKVD personnel that would make his subsequent appointment to lead the organization operationally manageable. His appointment as head of the NKVD in September 1936, replacing Genrikh Yagoda, who was himself subsequently arrested and executed, was the decisive step. The appointment came with a specific mandate. Yagoda had been deemed insufficiently energetic in implementing the terror, too slow, too cautious, too protective of certain categories of accused. Yezhov was appointed precisely because he was expected to apply the terror with greater speed and greater scope, to deliver the mass operations that Stalin's political requirements demanded. The period from late 1936 through 1938 that became the Yezhovshchina was the most intense phase of the Soviet political terror, the period in which the machinery of repression was applied at a scale and with a speed that had no precedent even in the earlier phases of Soviet political violence. The operations that Yezhov organized and directed during these years were documented in the NKVD's own records, many of which became accessible after the Soviet collapse, and which provide a detailed picture of how the terror was operationally conducted. The mass operations of 1937 and 1938 were organized through specific NKVD orders that established quotas of people to be arrested and categorized by the sentences they would receive. Order 00447, issued in July 1937, which is among the most documented of these operational orders, established the framework for the mass operation against what it called anti-Soviet elements, former kulaks, criminals, and other enemies. It assigned to each region specific numbers of people to be arrested, divided between two categories, those to be shot and those to be sentenced to 8 to 10 years in labor camps. The quota system is one of the most documented and most analytically significant features of the terror's operational design. The establishment of specific numbers of people to be arrested and executed meant that the process was driven by numerical targets rather than by investigation of specific individuals. Regional NKVD offices that reached their quotas could request and regularly did request increases, expanding the targets upward with a competitive energy that reflected the institutional incentives of an apparatus rewarded for the scale of its operations rather than for their accuracy. The Moscow headquarters under Yezhov reviewed and approved these quota requests, and the documented pattern is one of consistent upward expansion, the terror's scope growing through the interaction of central direction and regional initiative in ways that produce the eventual totals. Approximately 386,000 people were executed under Order 00447 alone, a number that represents only one of several mass operations conducted simultaneously. The national operations were additional mass prosecutions targeting specific ethnic categories. Germans, Poles, Latvians, Finns, Greeks, Chinese, Koreans, Iranians, and others were targeted through specific orders that assigned arrest quotas by nationality. These operations reflected both the specific paranoia about foreign connections that characterized Stalin's terror logic and the broader expansion of the terror's scope to encompass essentially any category of person that could be defined as potentially connected to hostile foreign powers. The total executions during the Yezhovshchina years of 1937 and 1938, documented in NKVD records that historians have analyzed extensively, were approximately 750,000 people. The total arrests were approximately 1.5 million. The numbers are so large that they resist comprehension at the individual human level and require the kind of statistical analysis that historians have applied to document the terror's scope. Though statistical analysis is itself a form of distance from the reality of what each number represented in terms of a human life ended or destroyed. Yezhov's personal role in the terror was not merely organizational. He was present at interrogations. He participated in the physical abuse of prisoners. Documents from the NKVD archive record his direct involvement in specific interrogation sessions, including sessions involving senior defendants whose cases he managed personally. His participation was not simply that of an administrator managing an institutional process from a distance. He was hands-on in ways that reflected both his personality and the culture of the institution he ran. The culture of the NKVD under Yezhov was one of organized violence conducted in an atmosphere of mutual terror. The interrogators who extracted confessions from prisoners were themselves subject to the institutional pressure of production quotas, required to produce confessions at rates that the pace of arrests demanded, working in conditions that made the line between the perpetrators and potential victims of the system dangerously thin. Senior NKVD officers lived with the constant awareness that they knew too much, that their knowledge of the terror's actual mechanics, the manufactured confessions, the torture, the fabricated evidence, the predetermined verdicts, made them potential liabilities if the political winds shifted. They were simultaneously the system's most essential operational personnel, and the people whose inside knowledge made their eventual elimination the most logical institutional outcome. This awareness created a specific psychological atmosphere within the NKVD that is documented in the memoirs of survivors and in the interrogation records of NKVD officers who were themselves subsequently arrested. The perpetrators of the terror operated in the constant awareness that they could become its victims, that the line between signing the arrest order and receiving it was thinner than the institutional hierarchy made it appear, that the protection their current position provided was entirely contingent on the continued favor of the man at the top. The signs that Yezhov's favor was ending began to appear in 1938. The specific mechanisms through which Stalin signaled his intention to replace Yezhov followed the pattern that characterized his management of all his senior subordinates: the gradual reduction of access, the appointment of alternative figures to positions that overlapped with Yezhov's authority, the quiet accumulation of material that could be used against him when the decision to move against him was made final. Lavrenti Beria was appointed as Yezhov's first deputy in July 1938, a development whose implications were transparent to anyone familiar with how the Soviet personnel system worked. The appointment of a senior figure as deputy to an incumbent was the standard mechanism through which Stalin prepared replacements, giving the designated successor access to the institution's operations, while the incumbent's authority was effectively being transferred. Beria's arrival in the NKVD was accompanied by his own investigations into the institution's operations, investigations that produced material on Yezhov and his associates that was simultaneously a genuine audit of the terror's conduct and the construction of the case that would eventually be used against Yezhov himself. The investigations documented not only operational matters, but personal ones. Yezhov's drinking, which had become severe during the terror years, his sexual conduct, his associations with people who were being characterized as enemies or foreign agents. Yezhov's personal behavior during the terror years reflected the psychological cost of what he was doing, though the historical record does not provide access to his inner experience in ways that would allow confident interpretation. His drinking increased dramatically. His personal relationships were erratic. He oscillated between periods of intense operational energy and periods of apparent psychological disintegration. The man who had been described by contemporaries in the early 1930s as energetic, precise, and professionally disciplined had become, by 1938, someone whose behavior, was creating operational problems for the institution he ran. Whether this deterioration reflected a psychological response to the scale of violence he was managing, a recognition of the danger of his position, or simply the effects of alcohol on someone who was drinking more than could be sustained without physical and psychological consequences, is something that historians can note without being able to definitively explain from the available record. Yezhov was formally removed as head of the NKVD in November 1938, replaced by Beria. He retained the title of People's Commissar of Water Transport, a position of no political significance that followed the standard Soviet pattern of ceremonial reassignment preceding arrest. He was removed from the Politburo. His access to Stalin, which had been the foundation of his entire institutional position, was terminated. The period between his removal from the NKVD in November 1938 and his arrest in April 1939 was one of waiting, of the specific terror that he understood better than almost anyone because he had inflicted it on others so comprehensively. He knew what was coming. He knew the process. He had been the process, had run it, had applied it to thousands of people in positions not entirely unlike the one he now occupied. His arrest in April 1939 initiated the interrogation process that he had overseen from the other side for years. The NKVD under Beria applied to Yezhov the same methods that Yezhov had applied to the terror's victims: the extended interrogation, the sleep deprivation, the physical pressure, the construction of a confession that would serve the prosecution's purposes. The confession that Yezhov eventually provided was comprehensive in ways that reflected both the effectiveness of the interrogation process and possibly something else. A man who understood the system completely and who knew that resistance was pointless, that the outcome was determined, and that the only remaining question was the form his destruction would take. He confessed to being a foreign spy, working simultaneously for German, Polish, British, and Japanese intelligence. The simultaneous service to 4 mutually hostile foreign intelligence services was a standard feature of the terror's accusation framework, its implausibility apparently no obstacle to its use. He confessed to organizing a conspiracy within the NKVD to prepare a coup against the Soviet government. He confessed to personal crimes including homosexual conduct, which was criminalized under Soviet law. The specific charges in the confession were constructed from the material that Beria's investigations had developed, from the testimony of NKVD officers who had been arrested and had named Yezhov in their own confessions, and from the standard repertoire of accusations that the Soviet prosecution system had refined across years of application. Yezhov's trial was not a public show trial of the kind he had helped to prepare for the Moscow trials of 1936 to 1938. It was a closed military tribunal, conducted without public observers, without the theatrical elements that the earlier trials had featured. The decision not to stage a public trial reflected Stalin's calculation that making Yezhov a public defendant would raise uncomfortable questions about the terror's conduct and about Stalin's own direction of it, questions that a closed proceeding could avoid. The tribunal convicted him on February 3, 1940. He was sentenced to death. He was executed the following day, February 4, 1940, at Kommunarka. Contemporary accounts and historical reconstructions based on testimony of people who had contact with him in his final period describe a man who had psychologically collapsed, who wept, who oscillated between declarations of devotion to Stalin and expressions of the terror that his situation produced. Whether he maintained to the end the genuine belief in Stalin's correctness that his earlier career had demonstrated, whether he had come to understand the system differently from the inside of its prisons than he had from the position of its operational director is not something the historical record allows us to determine with confidence. He was erased from the official record with the same thoroughness that had been applied to the thousands of people who had been erased under his direction. Photographs in which he appeared were retouched to remove him. The most famous of these retouched photographs shows Stalin walking alongside a canal in 1937, with a clear space at his side where Yezhov had been standing before his removal from the image. The photograph is one of the most reproduced illustrations of Soviet historical revisionism, the physical absence where a person had been made visible as a blank in the image. His name was removed from official documents, from the institutional histories that credited him with the NKVD's operations, from the public record that had briefly celebrated him as a loyal servant of the party and the state. He became an unperson in the specific Soviet sense, his existence officially unacknowledged, his name not to be spoken in official contexts, his historical role attributed to others or simply omitted from the accounts of the period. The Yezhovshchina was renamed. The terror that had been called by his name was reframed as an institutional excess that the party had subsequently corrected. Beria's appointment represented as the correction rather than as the continuation under different management. Yezhov became the explanation for the terror rather than its instrument, the individual whose personal pathologies could absorb the institutional responsibility that would otherwise have to be attributed to the system itself and to Stalin's direction of it. This reframing served obvious political purposes. It allowed the Soviet leadership to acknowledge that the terror had produced serious injustices while attributing those injustices to a specific individual rather than to the system's fundamental logic. It preserved Stalin's position as the corrector of excess rather than the architect of mass murder. It made the terror explicable as a personal aberration rather than as a systemic feature. The historical scholarship that developed after the Soviet collapse, using the NKVD archive materials that became partially accessible in the 1990s and early 2000s, has comprehensively documented the degree to which this reframing was false. The mass operations were directed by Stalin. The quota increases were approved by Stalin. The specific decisions about who to target, when to expand the terror, when to contract it, were Stalin's decisions, communicated through the institutional channels that connected him to the NKVD's operational apparatus. Yezhov's role was real, and his personal responsibility for specific acts of violence was genuine and documented. But his role was that of an instrument, however willing and however personally involved in the violence's execution. The system that produced the terror, the political logic that required it, the decision-making that directed it, was Stalin's. Yezhov implemented what Stalin required, with the energy and the thoroughness that had made him useful for that purpose. The specific irony of his fate is the one that gives this story its particular quality. The man who had processed tens of thousands of people through the system of arrest, interrogation, confession, and execution was processed through the same system himself, by the same institutional apparatus, using the same methods he had applied and overseen. His interrogators were people he knew. Some of them had worked under him. They applied to him what he had applied to others, with the professional efficiency of an institution that had refined its methods across years of operation, and that had no reason to treat this particular defendant differently from any other, except perhaps the specific satisfaction or the specific unease of applying the system's methods to the man who had most comprehensively embodied that system in its most extreme period. He was small when he ran the NKVD. He was smaller when he was arrested. The photographs from his interrogation period, which survive in the archive and which historians have examined, show a man physically destroyed by what the months of imprisonment had done to him. The contrast with the photographs from his years of power so extreme that identification requires specific knowledge of who the emaciated figure in the prison photographs is. The Soviet system had a specific relationship with the bodies of its high-profile victims, a concern with the physical evidence of what the interrogation process had done that led to specific management of appearances at trials and in official records. Yezhov's closed trial meant that the condition of his body was not a public relations problem in the way it would have been in a show trial. The closed proceeding allowed the physical consequences of his imprisonment to remain unwitnessed by anyone outside the institutional apparatus. He was executed in the same facility where many of the people he had ordered executed had died. Kommunarka was one of the primary execution sites for high-profile victims of the terror, a facility whose grounds contained the remains of thousands of people processed through the system that Yezhov ran. The specific geography of his death, in the same physical space as many of his victims, is not symbolic in the sense of having been chosen for symbolic reasons. It is simply the functional reality of how the Soviet execution system operated, using specific facilities for specific categories of prisoner. His remains were buried at Kommunarka. There is no memorial. There is no marker of the specific location of his grave within the facility's grounds. He is buried among the people he killed, or near them, the executioner and the executed occupying the same ground in the final accounting of what the terror produced. The historical assessment of Yezhov is one of the most difficult in the entire literature on the Soviet terror, because it requires holding simultaneously the reality of his genuine perpetration of mass violence and the reality of his being a product and an instrument of a system whose logic preceded and determined his actions in ways that simple individual moral accounting cannot fully capture. He was not a good man in any sense that the words can bear. He supervised the torture and execution of hundreds of thousands of people. He was personally involved in the abuse of prisoners. He ran an institutional apparatus whose scale of violence was without precedent in the Soviet system's history up to that point. The personal responsibility for specific acts of violence is documented and is real. But he was also a product of the system he served, a man whose specific combination of qualities, the organizational ability, the personal devotion to Stalin, the absence of independent moral or political standing, the willingness to implement whatever the system required, made him exactly the instrument that the system needed for the specific operational demands of the terror years. He did not create the system. He did not generate the political logic that required mass repression. He did not make the decisions about scope and scale and targeting that determined what the terror would be. He implemented them thoroughly, efficiently, without the hesitation or the moral resistance that might have made him less useful, but that might also have limited the damage. He was the instrument, and the instrument worked as it was designed to work, until the system decided that the instrument itself had become a liability. That is the specific quality of his story that makes it something more than the story of a monster getting what he deserved. It is the story of how the system works, of how it generates perpetrators from ordinary human material, of how it uses people until they are no longer useful and then processes them through the same machinery they operated, and of how the institutional logic of mass repression contains within it the terminal outcome for everyone who serves it deeply enough. The man who signed the death warrants was shot in the same way as the men whose death warrants he signed. The man who organized the interrogations was interrogated by the same methods he had organized. The man who ran the system was run through the system. The symmetry is not justice. It is not redemption. It is not even meaningful in any moral sense that provides comfort or closure. It is simply the operational logic of a system that had no loyalty to any individual, that used people until it didn't need them, and that processed them out of existence when their usefulness ended. Nikolai Yezhov understood that system better than almost anyone alive in 1940. He had built significant parts of it. He had operated it at its most extreme. He knew exactly what it was and exactly what it did, and then it did it to him. That is the whole story. That is the Yezhovshchina, from the inside, from beginning to end. The executioner, the execution, the blank space in the photograph where he used to stand. History has restored him to that space, not to honor him, but to understand what was there, and what it meant, and why the system produced it, and what it cost the hundreds of thousands of people who died before the system finally turned to face the man who had been its most willing and its most terrible servant. February 4th, 1940. The room at Kommunarka, the wall, the shot, the end of the Yezhovshchina, and the beginning of the historical reckoning with what it was, and why it happened, and what it tells us about the systems that human beings build, and the uses to which they put each other in service of power.